Committee on the Interior, Energy, and the Environment and the Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs will now come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I'd now like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. Today we're going to continue our hearing series on the work of agency regulatory reform task forces. And we welcome representatives from the Department of the Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Energy to provide us with an update on their rollback of excessive, duplicative, and outdated regulations. Earlier this year, President Donald Trump issued Executive Orders 13771 and 13777 as part of a push to reduce the burdens that Federal regulators impose upon Americans. These executive orders required Federal agencies to repeal 2 regulations for every 1 new regulation they would like to impose. To help meet this requirement, the orders directed Federal agencies to establish a regulatory reform task force to review regulations and identify the ones that are unnecessary, impose excessive costs, or limit job growth. Over the last 2 months, the committee has heard from a number of agencies about the progress they've made on implementing these executive orders and their unprecedented efforts to take a fresh look at how our government regulates. My colleagues and I have been encouraged by what we've heard. For example, the Department of Education's task force uncovered a whopping 1,772 guidance documents, 600 of which were out of date or were interpreting laws that were no longer in effect. The Department of Agriculture reported during its first round of reviews, its task force composed almost entirely of career staff, identified over 275 regulatory and administrative recommendations to increase agency efficiency and reduce duplication. Agencies also testified how they've been able to reduce cost and the burden of their regulations while not compromising important health and safety considerations. For example, the folks at the Department of Health and Human Services testified that they're fulfilling their mission to remove burdens on patient-provider relationships. HHS personnel are also reassessing health care quality measures to ensure a focus on safety. The Department of Transportation representatives testified that as a result of their review, DOT is reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens and barriers to new technologies and saving the American public significant time and money while actually improving the safety and benefits of its regulations. This check on the massive regulatory state is long overdue. Our hardworking American taxpayers, landowners, small businesses, and individual consumers are counting on these agencies to get it right. As such, I'm confident my colleagues will respect the value of these agencies' efforts and our witnesses' time, and please remain focused on helping the committee evaluate the work of these task forces. To our witnesses today, I look forward to hearing about what your task forces have accomplished and how your work will encourage a more productive relationship with the regulated community, facilitate safe utilization of our resources, and incorporate the voices of states, localities, and tribes, and most importantly, save the American people time, money, and frustration. Which concludes my opening remarks. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs, Ms. Deming, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Farenholz, and I also want to recognize Chairman Palmer for convening this hearing today. I also like to thank Ranking Member Plaskett, who has joined us this morning, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being with us. This is the 3rd hearing our subcommittees have had on regulatory reform task forces, and I'm pleased we have had an opportunity to review the actions of 3 agencies which play an important role in ensuring clean water and air, promoting renewable energy, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, it is unfortunate that the agencies here today, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior and Energy, seem to be backing away from these responsibilities. I think it is important for us, members of Congress, agency officials, and the public at large, to remember the conditions that led a Republican president to create some of the very agencies before us today in the first place. There are stories from across the country, I know you know them well, of smog so thick the morning sun could not be seen and rivers that changed colors depending on the dye used that day. Outside Tampa, I'm from Florida, Lake Tonawanda had the largest fish kill in history, 26 million, because it was so polluted by discharges from 4 food processing plants. In my district, just a mile from the town of Zellwood, a 57-acre parcel of wetlands was used from 1963 to 1980 for a drum recycling company to store a deadly mixture of chemicals, just a short walk away from communities that developed after World War II. The contamination is still being modified and remediated by federal, state, and local agencies, just as the men and women who served before us understood the importance of safe, clean water, air, and safe land. We too must see the risk to future generations from climate change and act now to avert catastrophe. Unfortunately, I fear that recent administration actions indicate an abdication of these responsibilities. EPA, for example, has proposed repealing the Clean Power Plan, which provides states flexibility to limit carbon dioxide emissions. Without the Clean Power Plan, the United States will continue to release unsustainable levels of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Not only will repealing the Clean Power Plan negatively impact climate change, repealing it without replacing it with another plan to limit carbon dioxide will leave EPA in violation of the Clean Air Act. EPA is not alone in proposing rulemaking that will negatively impact climate change. The Department of Energy has called a so-called grid resiliency pricing rule, ostensibly to ensure that the power grid is resilient enough to meet demand that any disasters might befall it. The rule is in fact a giveaway to fossil fuel-based power plants. By providing aid to power plants that maintain a 90-day on-site fuel supply, the proposed rule would grant a ratepayer subsidy to power plants which are not sustainable. The Department of Energy similarly has proposed climate change impacting rules. The Bureau of Land Management within Interior has proposed delaying the Obama administration's methane waste rules. These rules require oil and gas companies to submit plans to cut waste, measure and report gas flared from wells, and dispose of gas that reaches the surface during drilling. Not only is this prudent management of our public lands, America should get our money's worth from the natural resources below ground, and we should ensure that nature is not left spoiled from drilling, but it also impacts climate change. The outcomes of the administration's actions are apparent and no matter how great some wish to deny their cause. Indeed, in Florida, we have seen sea levels increasing so steep that coastal communities like Miami Beach are investing billions to stay above water. I am, however, grateful to the chairman for calling this hearing so we can further investigate the reasons behind administrative actions and the policy goals they serve and provide comment and insight on how agencies can more effectively serve the American people. I do look forward to the discussion, and thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize the chairman of the Intergovernmental Affairs Subcommittee, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman and the ranking members for the subcommittees for participating in this hearing, and I thank the witnesses for being here. This administration has seized upon a real opportunity to undo much of the damage our government has created through years of overregulation. Many of us have seen firsthand the consequences of excessive regulation by way of lost jobs and strained economic conditions and stifled growth in our districts and really around in the entire American economy. There's been a major decline in business startups. In fact, the Gallup organization put out a report that said that prior to 2008, there were 100,000 more businesses starting up than were closing. But by 2014, there were 70,000 more businesses closing than starting up. And this was a period of unprecedented overregulation. My subcommittee has heard countless stories from states and local governments and individuals about their inability to make decisions that are most important to them simply because their hands are tied by the cost or logjam or the uncertainty created by inconsistent and often contradictory federal regulations. The issue has simply gotten out of hand. Even agencies themselves testified they were amazed at the number of guidance documents and policy memos and other regulatory documents that they maintained once they began their review. As the chairman noted, it's been encouraging to hear from the agency representatives that they are working to end this practice of overregulation and start repairing the relationship that the government has with its people, beginning with the elimination of obsolete and duplicative and contradictory regulations. It's my understanding that tomorrow the committee will be considering a bill, the full committee will be considering a bill by our colleague Mark Meadows from North Carolina, which seeks to codify the administration's regulatory reform proposals. I look forward to that discussion. I appreciate the input our agency witnesses have provided in these hearings to show how these policies are yielding real results for the public by reducing not only the number of federal regulations and guidance documents, but also the costs and burdens that Americans face every day, which amount to trillions of dollars every year. In fact, last year alone, regulations cost the average household almost $15,000, which I'd like to point out places a disproportionate burden on lower income households, similar to what I grew up in. Agencies report that in just the first half of this year, their task forces have identified and withdrawn thousands of out-of-date, duplicative, burdensome, and costly regulations and policy documents. And I do want to comment, not to put any burden on our witnesses, the enthusiasm with which the people who have come in and testified about what they're doing. This is not policy work. We're not asking you to legislate, and we commend you for what you're doing. We have a remarkable opportunity here for us to modernize and streamline the federal government's approach to regulation. Mr. Jitendra Kohli, who led the United Kingdom's one in and two out regulatory reform initiative, testified at our first hearing that this is fundamentally about culture change. It really is, in changing the culture of government. I couldn't agree more. Getting our government to take a fresh look at how it operates and change its behavior is obviously no small task. And again, I commend you for the enthusiasm of which you've taken on this task, because I really believe that you're trying to do what's right for the American people, and I'm excited about what you're doing. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses today on how their regulatory efforts will have a lasting effect and how we can all work together to make the most of your progress and to do the most for the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the Interior, Energy, and Environment Subcommittee, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here this morning. Thank you, Chairman Palmer and Ranking Member Demings as well for holding this very important hearing. At President Trump's direction, political appointees at federal agencies are repealing regulations that protect the health, environment, and pocketbooks of average Americans. And worse, it would appear they're doing so under the cloak of darkness. This lack of transparency is very troubling and is depriving the American people of their right to participate in the rulemaking process. Let's take, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency. Administrator Scott Pruitt is not fully disclosing details about which protections he's planning to repeal and who is being consulted in that decision-making. This is especially concerning since it has been reported that members of the task force have previously had ties to corporations and corporate-sponsored organizations which have blocked efforts to clean up our air and water. Knowing if this is true or not would be very important to this body as well as to the American public. At the Department of Interior and Department of Energy, Secretary Ryan Zinke and Secretary Rick Perry, respectively, are not fully open about membership on their task forces that President Trump is using to dismantle life-saving regulations. Much is at stake. Americans just recently in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands have all recently endured 3 major hurricanes in succession, and scientists unanimously believe that climate change contributed to their severity of those hurricanes. Just 10 days before Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, President Trump signed an executive order revoking regulations that, quote, would have required the federal government to take into account the risk of flooding and sea level rise as a result of climate change when constructing new infrastructure and rebuilding after disaster. My constituents, the people in Puerto Rico, Texas, and Florida, and other areas which have suffered and passed from devastating hurricanes, and will unfortunately continue to do so, want our government to take into account climate change when building infrastructure. This would just appear to be a commonplace factor in the decision-making, and it will save lives. But it would appear that President Trump is rolling back this life-saving protection and many others. I look forward to hearing this morning from the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, and the Department of Interior, and I hope they will be forthcoming about what protections they are targeting for repeal, which companies would benefit, what are the factual justifications for doing so, how those task forces are composed, because the American people have a right to know what their government is doing. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this point, I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. From the Department of Interior, we have the Honorable David Bernhardt, and he's the Deputy Secretary there at DOI. We have Ms. Brittany Boland. She's the Deputy Associate Administrator of the Office of Policy at the Environmental Protection Agency and a former intern on this committee. She'll get to experience what it's like to be on the other side of the table today. And we have Mr. Daniel Simmons, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the witness, or let the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative, and y'all may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion and questions, we are going to ask that you each limit your testimony to around 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made a part of the record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows your remaining time, and the light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to turn on your microphones. We're budget conscious here. We didn't buy the most expensive microphones, so you actually do need to bring them close to your mouth so we can all hear you very well. So we'll start out with Mr. Bernhardt. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today regarding the Department of the Interior's progress implementing President Trump's regulatory reform Executive Orders 13771 and 13777. I serve as the Deputy Secretary to the Department of the Interior, and in addition to my role as the Department's Chief Operating Officer, I also serve as Interior's Regulatory Reform Officer. At Interior, we are acutely aware that President Trump, even as a candidate, clearly communicated a vision of empowering the private sector, as well as state, local, and tribal governments, by unleashing American exceptionalism and economic growth through reducing unnecessary and burdensome regulation while maintaining environmental protection and public health. At Interior, we're also committed to ensuring that the regulation that is necessary to advance our conservation legacy remains in place. If you were to go back and look at the President's speeches, you would find that during the campaign, he clearly articulated that certain regulations related to the Department of the Interior would be reviewed. In addition, as President, he has followed through with those statements with clear direction in executive orders and presidential memorandum. We intend to ensure that we fulfill his campaign commitments and meet his direction to the extent the law provides us the authority to do so. In addition, we are leaning forward to ensure that we move with due pace while meeting our legal requirements. You will see this when you review the upcoming fall agenda. Frankly, our measurable progress and pace to date benefited greatly from the collaborative experience of working with Congress to enact legislation under the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act was applied to 3 Interior rulemakings. Congress's decision to utilize the Review Act was important. It avoided imposing needless burdens on the American public, while also freeing up the administration's time to address other important areas of focus. At Interior, we administer the activities that take place on 1/5 of all of the land of the United States, as well as the Outer Continental Shelf, along with certain regulatory programs Congress has entrusted to us that are not related to the lands that we manage. We know that the substance, the procedure, and the pace of our decision-making can have a significant impact on a wide variety of activities. President Trump has actively sought to establish an agenda focused on economic growth. Executive Orders 13771 and 777 are keystones of his regulatory reform efforts. The Department's Regulatory Reform Task Force was formed on March 15, 2017. The task force meets monthly to evaluate existing regulations and provide recommendations to the Secretary regarding the repeal, replacement, or modification of such regulations. The task force focuses on regulations that place unnecessary burdens on the economy or the American people, that are outdated, ineffective, or unnecessary, or are incompatible with the regulatory reform principles or directions established in Orders 13771 and 13777. To facilitate the task force activities, we have invited public input to identify important areas of focus. We have received comments from a wide range of individuals and entities, including the environmental nonprofit community. Since we published a Federal Register notice asking for the public for ideas to lessen the regulatory burdens, we have received approximately 215 comments. In addition, we have established a website to periodically provide information to the public on regulatory reform and encourage the public to share ideas on specific regulations that should be repealed, updated, or otherwise improved. So far, after a review of existing regulations planned for publication, we've removed approximately 154 regulatory actions from the spring agenda. This reduced our previous inventory of 321 actions by almost half. Interior reported 13 deregulatory actions for fiscal year 17, and 28 are planned for 2018. At the heart of our regulatory reform agenda lies the President and Secretary's recognition that the Department of the Interior has a responsibility to be a good neighbor to those we serve. This responsibility includes creating and implementing a regulatory framework that serves both our conservation and our multiple-use missions. We have been and we will continue to be relentless in our efforts to minimize regulatory and permitting uncertainty, but we will do so while maintaining our important environmental and safety standards. I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boland, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Farenthold and Palmer, Ranking Members Plaskett and Demings, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for holding this important hearing on agency implementation of the President's executive orders on regulatory reform. My name is Brittany Boland, and I serve as Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I also serve on the EPA's Regulatory Reform Task Force. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify on the work of the task force under the leadership of Administrator Scott Pruitt to engage in meaningful regulatory reform that advances the agency's core mission of protecting human health and the environment. EPA's regulatory reform efforts over the last year have largely been driven by 2 executive orders, 13771 and 13777. In implementing these executive orders, EPA has emphasized 3 goals, which I would like to discuss today: transparency, public participation, and progress. First, EPA has enhanced the level of transparency for its regulatory reform work. As a first step, in March, Administrator Pruitt issued an agency-wide memorandum listing the names of the task force members and providing an open account of the specific direction to the task force and EPA program offices to solicit public input and the process for evaluating existing regulations. Then, in April, EPA launched a new regulatory reform webpage to provide the public comprehensive information on the task force, these executive orders, and opportunities for public input. The agency has periodically updated this website and is committed to continue to do so to keep the public well informed of our actions. In regards to public participation, EPA has provided an unprecedented level in its regulatory reform work. Beginning in April, EPA offices invited more than 200,000 stakeholders to participate in 11 public meetings and teleconferences on regulatory reform. In order to provide an open and fair opportunity for all members of the public to provide input, EPA issued a Federal Register notice opening a formal docket with a 30-day public comment period. In those 30 days, the EPA received a total of more than 460,000 public comments. While many of these comments were form letters, over 63,000 were unique individual comments, which set an EPA record. These comments range from a few pages dedicated to one rule to dozens of pages providing detailed information regarding several rules. EPA is continuing to review and carefully analyze these comments, and any specific regulations that the agency may review or may consider revising will indeed provide further opportunity for public comment in accordance with the Administrative Procedure Act. Underpinning all of this work is a commitment to achieving meaningful progress in air and water quality, land cleanup, safe chemicals, while meeting the executive order deliverables to reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens on the American people. In accordance with Executive Order 13771, in fiscal year 2017, EPA rules imposed no new net costs, and we finalized at least 2 deregulatory actions for each regulatory action. EPA expects the same for fiscal year 2018, but further details regarding specific regulatory and deregulatory plans for fiscal year 2018 will be in the forthcoming unified agenda to be published by the Office of Management and Budget. As EPA moves forward with its regulatory reform efforts, the agency will continue to update the public and Congress with our progress. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on the work of EPA's Regulatory Reform Task Force. I appreciate the time I spent with bipartisan committee staff last month, briefing them on the task force's work, and I look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Simmons, your 5 minutes starts now.
Thank you. Chairman Farenthold, Palmer, Ranking Members Plaskett and Demings, and members of both subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your interest in regulatory reform of the Department of Energy. DOE is committed to reducing unnecessary, unreasonable, duplicative, and outdated regulatory burdens on American families and businesses. We are also committed to clean air, clean water, and continuing to improve the environment. Earlier this year, the President issued several executive orders that have guided our regulatory reform efforts. The President issued Executive Order 13771, reducing regulation and controlling regulatory costs, Executive Order 13777, enforcing a regulatory reform agenda, and Executive Order 13783, promoting energy independence and economic growth. Executive Order 13777 required the head of each head of each agency to designate an agency official as its regulatory reform officer, and that the agency establish a regulatory reform task force. Following the directions in these orders, DOE formed a regulatory reform task force, and the DOE Chief of Staff was designated as the regulatory reform officer. The Chief of Staff delegated the regulatory reform officers to me, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. To inform the work of the Regulatory Reform Task Force, DOE published a request for information in the Federal Register on May 30th, seeking comment from the public on DOE's regulations. DOE received 132 separate comments from businesses, trade associations, advocacy groups, and other interested stakeholders. DOE also established a dedicated email box, regulatory.review@hq.doe.gov, through which interested parties can communicate their regulatory reform ideas to DOE on an ongoing basis. In addition, upon request, DOE has met with interested parties seeking to provide comments on DOE's regulatory reform activities, and we will continue to do so. On October 24, Secretary Perry sent a report to the White House detailing the task force's findings in response to Executive Order 13783 on energy independence. That report was also published online. DOE's task force made the following recommendations. Number one, streamline LNG natural gas exports. Several commenters encouraged DOE to expedite the export of LNG. On September 1, DOE issued a proposed rule to provide faster approvals of small-scale natural gas exports, including LNG. The comment period for that proposed rule closed on October 16. DOE is currently reviewing the comments and plans to complete the rulemaking in the near future. Number two, review our policies with regard to the national labs. DOE is the steward of 17 national labs, and it is critical that the important research and development work that occurs at the national lab is less encumbered by bureaucracy, and that more of the money goes to the actual research and development to get to Congresswoman Deming's concerns about the environment. And we have identified several areas for reform that would permit the national laboratories to operate more efficiently, focusing more time and resources on their mission-critical work. Number three, review DOE's implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. DOE received several comments that called for streamlining and simplifying the agency's regulations and internal operations related to NEPA. The goal is to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of DOE's compliance with NEPA in reviewing and approving permits. And number four, review DOE's Appliance Standards Program. As required by statute, DOE implements minimum energy conservation standards and separate test procedures for more than 60 categories of appliances. The majority of the comments received from the public, both in the request for information and in meetings, concerned, number one, existing DOE energy conservation standards and test procedures, and two, the procedures DOE follows in issuing those regulations. Many commenters asked DOE to follow and review the so-called process rule. The process rule is a rule that describes the procedures, interpretations, and policies that guide DOE in establishing new or revised energy efficiency standards for consumer products. DOE will also consider voluntary, non-regulatory, and market-based alternatives to standard setting when supported by statute. To this end, yesterday, DOE published in the Federal Register a request for information seeking comment on potential market-based approaches, such as those used to set average fuel economy standards for vehicles. Such approaches may reduce compliance costs and increase consumer choice while preserving or enhancing appliance efficiency. DOE will continue to work with the public on the regulatory reform process, as we will work to achieve the President's goal of reducing burdens on Americans' families and businesses. At the same time, we work to continue to protect the environment. As DOE identifies additional areas for reform, the Department will provide more opportunities for public participation, consistent with DOE's commitment to an open, transparent, and accountable rulemaking process. I appreciate the opportunity to testify here today to explain DOE's efforts to achieve meaningful regulatory reform. I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Simmons. It's my normal policy to save my questions for last. Unfortunately, today, simultaneously with this hearing, there is a Judiciary Committee markup, so at some point I may need to leave for a short period of time to vote. So I'm going to go ahead and ask my questions first in the event I do have to move over to the Judiciary Committee for a couple of minutes. So I now recognize myself for 5 minutes.
You usually play cleanup.
I usually bat cleanup, I do. I may have to do a second round of questions if we have to clean up. All right, Mr. Simmons, in Secretary Perry's October 25th report on regulatory reform under the heading of streamlining natural gas exports, and you talked a little bit about y'all working on that, the DOE must conduct a public interest review, I think is what it's called. Can you tell me the basis for this statement?
I cannot. I will happily get with the Office of Fossil Energy.
All right, well, here's where I'm going on this. As I read the Natural Gas Act, Section 3A, the department must issue an approval on application unless it affirmatively finds, based on evidence in the record, that exportation will not be consistent with the public interest. So what that means to me is, unless evidence in the record shows the export is not in the public interest, the approval should be granted. Unfortunately, through the previous administration insisted on a public interest review as a reason to delay projects, I think. Since it isn't required or authorized by the Act, shouldn't we get rid of this concept and apply the law as it's written?
We are, at DOE, we're always in favor of applying the law, so.
All right, well, we have companies in Texas whose export authorizations have been delayed for years by what I consider to be this unauthorized and illegal policy. I do ask that you take it back to Secretary Perry and the folks at the DOE to consider modifying the report to make it consistent with the law, and rather than doing a public interest review, granting it unless the record or information positively shows that it's not in the public interest. Also, this committee, the full committee, a couple years ago held a field hearing in Fargo on the oil and gas industry and federal regulations affecting it. Some of the testimony at that hearing indicated that in a horizontal well drilling, that's where they go down a mile or two and then they take a turn and go out a mile or two, that they could get a permit from the state in a month, maybe two. But if any part of that horizontal drilling went under any federal property, whether that's a federal highway or something, it could take the permitting process over a year. Has the Department of the Interior looked at this and other examples of the amount of time it takes to comply with regulations, as well as just whether the regulations are burdensome or unnecessary? Mr. Bernhardt.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. We are looking at things from the following perspective. What is in law and regulation? What is in guidance? And what are our actual business practices in processing permits and NEPA documents, for example? And what we find is that there is a great deal of business process practices that probably can be reformed and shortened significantly, primarily through what is called the surnaming process at the department. People review, you may have 40, 50 people review a single document before it goes to the Federal Register, and we're looking at that to make that process a more streamlined and efficient process itself.
Mr. Simmons, DOE looking at process to get the stuff out faster, whether it's these LNG exports or other things y'all are dealing with?
Without a doubt, and that is, with LNG exports in particular, we are very much concerned about streamlining that process so it doesn't take years, but takes a more reasonable amount of time.
All right, and then let me, Ms. Boland, I don't want to ignore you, and I may get everybody else's input on this as well. A lot of your agencies employ folks from the private sector who have moved over into the industry. Some have said that this may create a conflict of interest when somebody who lobbied for or worked in the private sector affected by a regulation is in reviewing that regulation. Other people say, look, this provides valuable insight from stakeholders who are affected by these regulations. I'm going to ask Ms. Boland to start and the rest of the witnesses to just comment quickly on whether you see a conflict of interest there or whether you see value in having another perspective in their view of these regulations. Ms. Boland.
Thank you. So just first, I will say that all appointees at the agency do receive ethics training through senior career ethics officers, and so I think that there would not be any conflict of interest, as it's my understanding that they would be in compliance with their ethics obligations. In regards to their experience, certainly I think that the agency would have some value in getting the perspective of those that have been on the ground and have been working on implementing these regulations in real time.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons, did you have anything to add?
Just to add that, that the Department of Energy takes our ethical and our legal commitments very, very seriously, and that we strive to meet them as well, and that people, one of the things that we hope to have is people with a wide variety of backgrounds and experience to be able to provide additional information into all the matters that we consider.
Great. And Mr. Bernhard.
It's an interesting question as I look up and see the portraits of Abraham Lincoln, who was both a very successful lawyer and one of our greatest presidents. The first thing I would say is that the federal law and the Trump administration have laid out requirements for ethical practices. We have a team of experts at the department, and a variety of analyses take place about whether something is a matter, a general matter, a particular matter of general applicability, or a specific matter affecting a particular matter affecting specific parties. Depending on that type of issue, there are different regulations that apply, and guidelines need to be followed. Every PAS signs a ethical document laying out their requirements, and so we take this very seriously. We have training. We have guidance documents, and we have experts to ensure that we're held accountable.
Thank you very much. I see I went a little over with the answers. We now recognize Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying that, Mr. Bernhard, I see in your written testimony, you have as the mandate, one of your mandates, that President Trump has said that he has communicated a vision of empowering the private sector as well as state and local governments by unleashing American exceptionalism and economic growth through reducing unnecessary and burdensome regulations while maintaining environmental protection and public health. I have no problem with that statement, and I think the other members of this committee know that I may be one of the few Democrats who believe that we have maybe more regulations than are necessary. I've seen it in my own home in the Virgin Islands. The previous head of EPA was not really a friend of mine. I did not appreciate the maternalistic posturing that took place over the people of the Virgin Islands, who I believe knew better than she or the administration what environmental protections needed or did not need to be in place. However, that does need to be done legally and with transparency in that deregulation. And that is the concern that I have as a committee member here, that I'm not sure about the complete disclosure of the task forces that have been put in place for many of these agencies that are reviewing deregulation. I think that it's very important that the public know who is on the task force, the perspectives and backgrounds, while they may have followed conflicts, rules, and ethics laws in being there, how they may be swayed or may be influenced, I think is very important for the public to be aware of. Ms. Boland, the EPA put on its website on March 24th a memo that, among other things, provides the names of members of the agency's regulatory reform task force. Why did the agency decide to put the names online?
It was an agency-wide memorandum that the administrator signed, and part of just transparency, good government, we posted it on our website to keep the public informed.
And have you had any comments or thoughts from the public with regard to who the members of the task force are?
I am not aware of any direct questions regarding the task force membership.
Okay, thank you. Last week, the full committee ranking member, Elijah Cummings, sent a letter to both the Energy Department and the Interior Departments requesting the name of the task force members. Mr. Bernhardt, the Interior Department has not to date responded to Mr. Cummings' inquiry, nor are the names of the task force members available publicly. Why has the Interior taken this position thus far, or do they intend to put the task force members' names available to the public?
It's Representative, first, before I answer that question, I just want to say my heart goes out to your community. I was in the U.S. Virgin Islands 2 weeks ago looking at a variety of facilities as they relate to the Department of the Interior. So,
Thank you. And the National Parks has been a tremendous partner in that recovery. Many of the rangers acted as first responders immediately after the hurricane, and particularly on the island of St. John, really came to the support of the people, and we're really grateful for that.
I spent a lot of time with those folks a couple weeks ago, and also in terms of continuing rehab and ensuring that we had some facilities open.
Thank you.
So let me say this. It's my understanding that we have made the names of the task force available. I can't speak to the letter specifically, but I'm happy to provide you the names, and I'm happy to do that right now to the best of my recollection.
If you could put that in writing to us, and you said you've made the names available, where are they available?
Well,
to
I know
anyone
that
who wants to-
they've been made available to people who've asked, reporters and others. I'm not sure if they're online, but I know that from my perspective, they're certainly publicly available.
Is there a reason why the task force composition is not online or available to the public?
Probably not. I think from my perspective, the task force membership is likely to change as we get assistant secretaries and others in place, and the Senate has been relatively slow at providing those people, but we're certainly happy to make it available, and I'll certainly evaluate whether it ought to be on the web.
Okay, thank you. And the Energy Department as well, sir, Mr. Simmons, would you be able to provide those names to Mr. Cummings and to the committee? And is there a reason why those names are not public?
I believe we've already done both.
Okay.
As in, we did have a phone call with committee staff a couple days ago where we shared those names, number one. Number two, I don't know if it's posted on our website, but it has been the subject of FOIA, which I think has been released publicly, but we'll make sure those names are public.
You will make sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if you shared that with the full committee staff or the majority, but just, and thank you very much. I just think it's important that in the process of this, of the review that the task force is making, not only that the names of the members are there, but the process in which regulations they're reviewing are there for public comment as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll now recognize Mr. Palmer for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes I feel like I'm back on the Science, Space and Technology Committee again. My background, I worked for 25 years for a think tank. I helped set up a national network of state-based think tanks. But prior to that, I worked for 2 international engineering companies, one of which was in environmental systems. So I'm acutely aware of the regulatory burden imposed on the American economy, but also the importance of good regulations, sensible regulations. We've done a tremendous job of cleaning up the air and the water and the land in the United States. When I was still with the think tank, we published an annual report every 2 years, it may have been every 4 years, a report on the progress that's been made. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter the report into the record. It's entitled Alabama's Environment 2014, 6 Critical Indicators, but it has data from the EPA and federal agencies that reflect the progress for the entire country. The thing that I want to point out—
Objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, is that from 1980 to 2012, we saw a 462% increase in gross domestic product. But during that same, we also saw a 93% increase in vehicle miles traveled, a 38% increase in population growth, a 22% increase in energy consumption, but a 56% decrease in emissions. So I do commend the EPA and other federal agencies for the work that they've done in that regard, but that doesn't mitigate at all the need to clean up our the regulatory environment, so to speak, to get rid of the obsolete, the out-of-date, the duplications, the contradictions, so that we regulate effectively and appropriately. So I appreciate that. There was also a comment made about climate change in regard to hurricanes. We went through a 12-year drought of hurricanes. It was the lowest number of, the lowest hurricane activity on record until this past year. And I would also like to enter into the record a blog from Dr. Cliff Mass. He's University of Washington atmospheric scientist in regard to hurricane activity.
Without objection, will be entered into the record.
Thanks, sir. With that said, again, as I said in my opening comments, I'm very appreciative of the work that you're doing. I realize it's not policy work. It's more like an EPA cleanup effort. Have you received any pushback, serious pushback from career staff at your agencies? And we'll begin with you, Mr. Bernhardt, at Department of Interior.
I think that I would say that our folks have worked very.
Can you speak?
Our folks have worked very collaboratively with us, sir.
How about you, Ms. Boland?
Career staff have provided valuable expertise and collaboration with us throughout the regulatory reform work, and I've not personally received any pushback.
How about you, Mr. Simmons?
And I would also echo that the majority of the members of the regulatory task force are career, and they provide us with indispensable information as we move forward with regulatory reform.
Would you also say that by going through this process, it makes the career staff, it makes all of you more effective in carrying out the responsibilities that you have in the regulatory sphere? And I'll reverse order. I'll start with Mr. Simmons.
Oh, without a doubt. The vast majority of the work that the Regulatory Reform Task Force has been working on is our relations with the national labs. Congress appropriates billions of dollars a year that go to the national labs. And so we want to make sure that that process is as, strip out as much bureaucracy as we can, but also the people that have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis and will deal with it in 4 years and 8 years and 16 years, those are all career staff. So they very much want the best process possible, and that's why especially in that area, that their input has been so valuable to us.
Ms. Boland?
Certainly. So at the EPA, retrospective review of existing regulations is not new. There was a prior effort under the previous administration to conduct retrospective review, and the EPA, some of our environmental statutes require periodic reviews and potential revisions. So this is part of what the agency does on a regular basis.
Mr. Bernhardt?
I think since the establishment of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, with the establishment of the SES Corps, they understand clearly that administrations come and change policy perspectives, and that represents the will of the people, and they're prepared to work with everybody. That's generally my experience.
Well, my final point on this, and I realize I'm over time, Mr. Chairman, is that the point of this exercise is to bring clarity to the regulatory process, which not only benefits the American economy and the American people, as I said in my opening comments, it's costing the average household $15,000 a year. It enables those who are responsible for implementing the regulations, not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level, to be able to do their job effectively with the least negative impact on families and businesses. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize Ms. Demings from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. There's no doubt we want to get this right, and I am so glad that we've spent quite a bit of time talking about transparency. It is important, the public's input, the public's right to know is very, very critical to the overall process of getting things right. But it appears to me, under the current administration, science-based policies are being repealed and replaced with politics-based policies. We would hope that would not be the case under any administration, but it certainly appears that way to me. Ms. Boland, how many members of the Regulatory Reform Task Force previously worked for companies regulated by the EPA?
I do not have personal knowledge of the detailed backgrounds of all the members of the Regulatory Reform Task Force, though a majority were previous Capitol Hill staff.
So you don't know of anyone who works for a company or an agency that was regulated by the EPA that is currently a member of the task force?
To my knowledge, the members of the task force had not been employed by any members of the regulated community.
Okay. How many political appointees hired by Administrator Pruitt specifically worked for oil or chemical companies or their lobby groups? Do you know that answer?
I do not have personal knowledge of all of the political appointees' backgrounds.
Could you talk a little bit about, in general, about the backgrounds of persons that would be selected to serve on a task force to decide which regulations will remain or which regulations would be repealed?
Mm-hmm. Certainly. The members of the task force, I have full confidence in all of the qualifications of the members of the task force, given their experience on environmental and regulatory policy issues.
But you don't know of one who worked for a company or an organization that was regulated by the EPA?
The EPA task force is comprised of 4 senior staff members, and no, to my knowledge, none of the 4 have specifically been employed directly by a company that the agency regulates.
Do you know whether the Administrator Pruitt hired a former official with the American Petroleum Institute? Eric Baptist?
Yes, I'm familiar with Mr. Baptist.
A former official with BP, Troy Lyons?
Yes.
A former employee with Coke Companies, Madeline Morris?
With Congresswoman, the members that the last 3 that you just mentioned
Is
are not
is
on
Madeline
the task
Morris
force.
a member of the task force?
They are not members of the task force, no.
What's their current position, please?
Ms. Morris is no longer with the agency.
Okay, what was her position? Do you remember?
To the best of my recollection, was executive assistant. But Congresswoman, I'm happy to follow up through the proper channels with additional information that you have regarding political appointees at the EPA.
Okay, that would be great, and thank you so much for taking the lead in your organization, in your agency, for making sure that task force members' names were included up front on your website. And with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bernhardt, my understanding is that you say your department has taken 15 deregulatory actions, and you've got 28 more under review. Or
yeah, I think it's 13 and 28, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay, and would you give me an example of one of those that that you've taken action on?
Sure, and I think it's important to recognize that taking action, particularly for Interior, the President was very clear in his in certain executive orders, particularly those relating to energy, of regulations that he wanted us to look at, and so we did that. And you know, the process is not ultimately the task force's process. It's the process enshrined in law to review and modify regulations, which is through the Administrative Procedure Act. And that process itself is a very public process. So, for example, regulations related to related to hydraulic fracturing on federal land, regulations regarding methane. Those would be two specific ones where, after the task force reviewed them, they began going through a public process under the Administrative Procedures Act.
I have an article from one of the Washington newspapers here from a few months ago, and it says that the Obama administration issued final regulations in this last year alone that cost $164 billion. Is it one of your goals in this deregulatory effort to result in cost savings to taxpayers and businesses?
Right. So, at least from our perspective, the baseline is a zero increase in burden, and we're hoping to actually have the economic burden be a net decrease. So that's our ultimate goal.
All right. Ms. Boland, I heard you say that you've gotten 460,000 comments and 63, but most of them have been form letters, but 63,000 have been individual comments. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you're going through all those. Has the EPA taken any deregulatory actions yet?
Yes, we have several proposed deregulatory actions.
Several proposed?
And for fiscal year 2017, we were able to finalize a number of deregulatory actions as well.
All right. And would you give me an example of one of those?
Certainly. So for proposed deregulatory actions, we have a proposed repeal of the 2015 Waters of the United States rule. In terms of a final deregulatory action, we withdrew an information collection request for methane emission information from the oil and gas sector in March, and that information collection request is a deregulatory action under Executive Order 13771, and that is that information collection request alone was estimated by the agency to provide upwards of over $30 million in cost savings.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Simmons, what about your department? Have you taken any deregulatory actions as of yet?
We have not. The only deregulatory actions that we have finalized are not regulations per se, but as we work with the labs, we've taken some final actions there. Otherwise, just yesterday we published in the Federal Register a request for information on market-based reforms, as I mentioned in my testimony, to possible changes that we can make to the Appliance Standards Program. That was yesterday. Just today, this morning, we sent a request for information about how we could improve the process rule, and that should be published in the Federal Register in the next couple days. As well as we have put out a proposed rule to streamline small-scale natural gas exports, and we should be finalizing that in the not-too-distant future. I don't know the timeline, but in the not-too-distant future.
All right, thank you very much. I apologize. I had to go briefly to another hearing. I didn't get to hear your testimony. But, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and all those involved in this hearing. I think I wish this was purely bipartisan. I know there'd be some arguments, but I think getting regulations for the general public right, and that includes the business community. So, Mr. Bernhardt, representing Northern California and the California Delta, you have had a long relationship in this regard. For my colleagues, Mark Twain once famously said about water in California that whiskey was for drinking in California, but water was for fighting over. So, Mr. Bernhardt, this is in the context much like my friend and colleague from Florida. The regulation's important, but who's enforcing it is important, and whether there's a conflict of interest. So you have been in the department in the Bush administration. You have been a lobbyist with clients who have an interest in this field. When you were confirmed, you quote unquote said that you wouldn't act on any issues in regards to conflicts unless you were first authorized to participate, quote unquote.
You have had two former clients who've been in the news in California who seem to have crossed that bridge, at least from my perspective. Cadiz Inc. Is now allowed to pump groundwater in Southern California since you rejoined this administration, and that was a change in policy from the Obama administration. And then Westlands Water District has been involved in a subsidy that's been brought to us by the IG in the Delta Tunnels planning process. So my question for you is, have you sought or received any waivers to work on these matters or any other matters when it comes to California water?
My ethics recusal is very clear that I will not participate personally or substantially in any particular matter involving specific parties in which I know a former employee or client of mine is a party or represents a party.
So you're not involved right now in any policy in this regard either?
I'm sorry, I did not hear you, but let me finish addressing your first question. I've had no role in any particular matter regarding either of these, any particular matter involving specific parties, involving either of these two clients, and I've not sought a waiver in such instance.
So just on the issue of perception being important, obviously you have put some thought into this. How would you deal with the general public in California that would say, here's somebody who's worked in the administration, who's gone outside the so-called revolving door? Seems to me that you're trying to establish a bright line, but perception-wise, you've made money outside, and that might say that you know more about it. But is this sufficient, given the role you have and people who are working underneath you are carrying out this policy, knowing that you've had a relationship and may in the future have a relationship with these clients?
Well, let's be very clear. I think I've put in place the most robust process ever devised by a deputy secretary. And let me tell you, we have specific recusals. We require specific guidance. I have had training sessions, and I consult regularly with the experts. Every request for a meeting by me is run through, not by me, but for a meeting with me is run through ethics experts. So we've put into place a very robust process, and you know, I can't speak necessarily to what others may say, but at the end of the day, I know that this is a far more robust process than was ever in place when other folks from large law firms have joined entities like the Department of the Interior, and I will stand behind them. Could
you be more specific as to those other situations?
Sure. Go look at David Hayes, the deputy secretary who came from Latham Watkins. Go look at Janice Snyder. Those would be two from the prior administration. I could give you a long list. And in regards to policy matters, I think you'd find that their client list looked very similar to mine before they went into the Department of the Interior.
And when the time comes for you to re-enter the private sector, is it your intention to go back to your former law firm?
I have no intention to do that. You know, life leads the way it does. But certainly, when I left my law firm, I gave up my interest, and I don't have a relationship with my law firm in any sort of way, and the future will hold what the future does.
Okay, I appreciate those comments. You can certainly appreciate, from my perspective and my constituents, the perception that may be subjective, given their desire to protect the environment where they live and they're impacted by that. Certainly the perception is different. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Part of that perception is based on people not understanding the actual rules.
It's all based on perception. And with that, I'd be happy to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Montana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee, thank you for being here for this important work. I appreciate the President's order to identify overly burdensome, costly, and outdated regulations for repeal or revision, as well as the administration's desire for 2 rules to be repealed for every one that's added. One of the reasons I came to Washington was to make it easier for job creators back in Montana. Mr. Bernhardt, you have a huge job covering all the entities at Interior, from the National Park Service, the Office of Surface Mining and Reclamation, and the Enforcement, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Land Management controls just over 8 million acres in the state of Montana. The National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service each control another 1 million acres, so over 10 million acres in total. How did you, as part of this Regulatory Reform Act, how did you work with local and state organizations to collect input on what regulations to focus on? And if you could share some of the successes you've had.
So we've received comments from states. We've received comments from associations like the Western Governors Association. We've received comments from localities, some of which have very specific problems and some of which have more broader concerns. And what we do in our meetings is we take the comments that we've received between the last meeting and that one, and we go through them and we say, hey, this has merit. Let's have the Bureau do some research on that. And so that is the way. It's a very it's a process that anybody can take advantage of, and many have.
Okay, great. And I just applaud you for that work so far, and I encourage you to continue it. We've heard some concerns at these hearings about previous employment of staff assisting with this regulatory reform across the agencies. It's kind of, as a business guy, it's kind of puzzling to me why an agency assembling staff would not consider people with prior experience in the area they're going to be working. That seems to be portrayed as some kind of novel approach. In fact, it's been a practice that's been followed in prior administrations. For example, when not serving as the EPA's senior policy advisor to the administrator under President Obama, or Deputy Administrator for President Clinton's administration, Bob Sussman headed the environmental practice at a large D.C. law firm to advise and advocate for companies and trade associations. In the previous administration, Cameron Davis, a senior advisor to the EPA administrator, provided counsel on the Great Lakes policy and coordinated funding initiatives. His previous occupation was President and Chief Executive Officer of the Alliance for the Great Lakes. David McIntosh of the previous administration's EPA had also worked as a Clean Air Act litigator and regulatory lawyer at the National Resources Defense Council. In fact, that organization is well represented in that administration. The Department of Interior, Ned Farquhar, served as the National Resources Defense Council as an energy and climate advocate prior to being named Deputy Assistant Secretary for Lands and Minerals Management. Before Janice Schneider appeared before this very committee on behalf of the Department of Interior to defend its proposed stream protection rule in 2015, she co-chaired a large law firm's energy and infrastructure project siting and defense practice. Also in 2015, Mark McCall was appointed Executive Director of the Department of Energy's Loans Program, and this list goes on and on. Clearly, agencies have considered prior experience and hired people with expertise. So my question, after that long list of prior administrations, is it appropriate for agencies to select people who have experience to do the jobs they're being hired for? And each one of you, if you could answer.
Absolutely. Provided they follow the regulations and the ethical requirements that have been established by law.
Ms. Boland?
I agree with that statement.
And Mr. Simmons?
Agreed. Prior experience is incredibly important, as Mr. Bernhardt said, as long as we meet our ethical and legal obligations.
And I would just, you've been very clear that that was a requirement in all cases, that, as you had said, Mr. Bernhardt, you had separated yourself, as we do in our positions, from prior engagements so that we can serve the people of America. And you've done that in your agencies, and I applaud you for hiring talented, qualified people to fill these positions. And I thank you for your testimony today. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. Did we miss Mr. Grothman? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You disappeared when you disappeared and you're back. Welcome back.
I was hanging out in the Education Committee, but I wouldn't miss this for the world.
All right. Well, I apologize. You were recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Okay, I want to follow up a little bit again as far as the background of people you hire, and a lot of my experience actually came at the state level. But I always felt it was a big mistake to hire people in regulatory agencies straight out of college or academics, because they really didn't understand how burdensome those regulations are. Are any of you in your agencies hiring people straight out of university or people whose only experience has been in the world of academia? Or are you restricting yourselves, hopefully, to people who have experience with the businesses that are going to be regulated?
Well, I'll start by answering that. For the broad swath of hiring across DOE, we meet our human capital requirements, and we look to hire the best people for the appropriate job. For these entry-level positions, we definitely would like to have people right out of college, because I mean that's what those positions are, to give people experience. For more senior level positions, you definitely want people with various types of experience to provide that necessary information. So it all depends on the position for hiring.
Yes.
So certainly the agency does have fellowship programs with recent graduates, but just generally speaking, I'm aware that the political staff, I think, has a broad scope in their background and qualifications and levels of expertise that they can offer. But I couldn't speak to the agency as a whole's hiring practices.
Okay.
We have approximately 70,000 employees. We hire all sorts of folks, obviously at a policy level, at a senior level. What we see in folks tend to be people that have experience in state or local government, people that have experience in regulatory paradigms that are complicated, or people that have science backgrounds that are relevant to their mission.
I'm a little bit concerned, and I would like you to comment on this, because having dealt with regulatory agencies, sometimes somebody who has never worked outside of government, and that's fine, but they don't understand how burdensome a new regulation can be. Or, you may change a regulation from 3 years ago, you thought you were complying, now you're not, that sort of thing. I'm particularly a little bit concerned with, and I realize not your entire functions are regulatory. I mean, if you're hiring somebody for the parks or something, that's one thing. But if it's a regulatory agency that affects how somebody else is doing business with their property, I think it's important to hire somebody who's been on the other side first. And I wondered if you would ever consider even maybe putting an administrative rule, putting in requirements that people who work for the regulatory part of your agencies have to have 3 or 4 years experience first, so they understand how it looks when a new wave of paperwork is thrown at you, or you have to spend perhaps millions of dollars on something when 2 years ago you were in compliance. Would any of you comment on maybe if you would ever even have the ability to maybe put some administrative rule in effect, so you greatly increase the chance that you'll be hiring people who have experience other than just college-related, if they are interacting with private individuals?
Yeah, I've never thought about the rulemaking, but I will give you a similar example, and that is, at times I think the folks that we have in our headquarters, even if they're regulatory people, don't necessarily know what folks are actually doing on the ground, and the challenges that our field office are facing. And I've seen this, and one of the things we're looking at is ensuring that the people that are making regulatory policy decisions actually know what the on-the-ground effects are, even within the local regulators, because I think their perspective tends to be a little different because they are there experiencing these things as well. Your idea is an interesting one. We'd have to talk to our lawyers.
Okay, Ms. Boland?
I would have to take back your suggestion, but I will offer that the Office of Policy, the office in which I serve, does have a program that we've relaunched that was first initiated under the Clinton administration, known as Common Sense, and now we have rebranded it to Smart Sectors, which is an opportunity for the agency to develop partnerships with the regulated community and to provide a means for career staff to get on the ground tours and site visits and to better understand the regulated community. And this is just a partnership that we relaunched several months ago. That was something past administrations have done to try to bridge the gap between career staff and the regulated entities.
Right. One way to make sure that the staff always understands the regulated community is make sure you hire them from the regulated community. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Just checking to make sure nobody else walked in. All right. With that, I'll thank our witnesses again for being here. It was great hearing from you, great hearing about the wonderful work that y'all are doing to reduce our regulatory environment. We're going to hold the record open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. And if you guys would be so kind as to reply to any of those we get, it would be greatly appreciated. If there being no further business, without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.